Welcome everyone to Color Commentary. We are your pauper commentators, Michael Petchik and Adrian Guarzales. How's it going, Adrian?
Pretty good, Mike. How are you?
Doing all right. I start a job in a few weeks, so that's neat. But let's take care of the upkeep and get into. What were you gonna say?
You don't message me enough for someone who's unemployed.
No, I'm just busy with other things. It's not that I'm unemployed; it's that I'm pre-employed.
Gotcha. Narrows eyes.
Don't worry. We'll have plenty of good discussion tonight to make up for that. So let's take care of the upkeep. First off, this week, as every week, we are brought to you in part by Original Magic Art. Original Magic Art has a variety of tokens, playmats, and dice bags, and art prints from throughout the history of Magic and the world at large. And if you want to jazz up your play space, make it a little bit fancier, perhaps add a certain je ne sais quoi to your evenings of Magic, you can go to originalmagicart.com/commentary, spelled as it is in the name of this podcast, or on checkout, use the affiliate code commentary in all caps. That'll let them know that we sent you, and you'll get a little bit of a discount on your order. So that's a nice thing for all involved. We get, a little bit to keep the lights on here. You get a little bit of money off your order of gorgeous playmats and just stellar products. We stand by them. What do you have for us this week, Adrian?
Hon. I have Le Petit Patreon. For just $1 an episode, you too can hear the full show, including the pre- and post shows, as well as getting access to our Patreon-exclusive Discord channel. I'd also like to remind everyone the latest episode of Commontary, we will finally be starting a new cycle of games. Will be out on Saturday the 25th. Hopefully going to have a lot of improvements based on the feedback. All the videos we've shown recently were from the same recording session, so we didn't, can't go back in time and make some of the fixes, but hopefully they'll be fixed this time around.
I'm excited. I've heard that there are some matches from not necessarily like untiered decks, but slightly more rogue elements within the format.
Hon.
All right. One last thing before we get into the episode. I'm gonna be at. Oh crap! Never mind. I was gonna tell you. I'll be at GP Providence this weekend. This episode will air after that. Never mind. If I saw you there, cool. If you said hi to me, also cool. Let's move on to the episode.
If you said hi to him and you become a patron, what kind of monster are you?
I just don't know. I just don't know who would do that, Adrian. All right. So let's talk about a deck that 5-0'd and showed up in the league results this week.
We had our recent episode in defense of the jank. And Mike and I always say, if you want us to cover a deck, show us the results. That's all we care about. We're elitist spikes, so that's what we want. Well, boy howdy, did some jank 5-0 today. Black Red Burn by Tominus. You decide.
I've given up on trying to pronounce usernames at this point. I'm convinced most are not supposed to be said out loud, and if I do, I'm just going to screw it up. So whatever this user's actual pronunciation for their username is, we're talking about Black Red Burn.
Which is an archetype that you'll recall Mike and I have said will never work. And here it is.
Yeah, it managed to 5-0, which means that obviously you could 5-0 with anything with enough luck pretty much. But I mean, there was intent put into this. This is not, just a pile of cards. There is some actual work that went into this. So we figured we should talk about it, and we could start off just with the creatures. There's 2 Gurmag Anglers is the only creatures in this deck. So 6 and a black for a 5/5 with Delve. This feels weird to me. I'm not gonna lie.
Well, it's a card that doesn't really synergize with the rest of the deck in the same way that you might expect some of the traditional burn creatures to synergize, like the Archer or Thermo Alchemist or even Gitu Lava Runner. However, a 5/5 is not bad in this format. You'll have plenty of Delve fuel for it, and we've discussed before on the show that this is actually pretty tough to answer for a lot of decks. So it's probably fine as a beater, late game beater.
Yeah, I mean, it's... I can see there being awkward games where you have 2 of these in your opener, and since this is ostensibly still a burn deck, you do kind of want to be on the faster side of things. Obviously, we're taking a hit here by playing 2 colors, so it's going to be a little bit slower, but I guess this does kind of give you a late game inevitability. Just slam this big thing and start turning it sideways. But not exactly the most appealing to me. Next, we have 4 copies of Bump in the Night, which is a black mana for a sorcery. Target opponent loses 3 life. Flashback 5 and a red.
And I'm willing to guess this deck does not get to the flashback a whole big lot. It could. It could, but I find that very unlikely. 6 mana is a lot of mana.
Yeah, I think most of the time this is just black opponent loses 3 life at sorcery speed, and occasionally you're going to get value out of that flashback. And when you do, great, but I feel like you're not playing this for the flashback. It's a nice additional factor to the card. 4 copies of Chain Lightning. Everyone knows it. Everyone loves it. It's red for sorcery, deals 3 damage to any target. Also, I would love to read you the new Oracle text on this. Then that player or that permanent's controller may pay red. If that player does, they may copy the spell and choose a new target for this copy. This is...
hell.
One of these days we're going to get a better version of this, right?
I mean, this card is from Legends, and we have not, so I would say no.
It's frustrating to me because this is probably... I mean, apart from the 4 Lava Spikes, which are also included in this deck, is probably one of the worst Bolt variations, but...
Well, this is better than Lava Spike. Lava Spike cannot do damage to creatures.
That's true. It can't be reflected, but I can probably, in years of playing Pauper, count on one hand the number of times that clause has been relevant.
Yeah, it's happened to me like maybe once total. For all intensive purposes, it's the same as Bump in the Night. Generally, you don't want to use your burn spells on creatures unless you're losing the game, in which case your burn spells aren't doing a whole lot. So really better at the face.
Yeah. So we also have the 4 copies of Lava Spike, which is a sorcery with the subtype Arcane, which does not matter here. And it's just a red for 3 damage to target player. This is a staple of Modern Burn. It shows up in Pauper Burn all the time. That 1-to-3 ratio is just like the perfect point for a majority of decks. Then we've got 3 copies of Faithless Looting. So red for draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, flashback 2 and a red. This one, I have to feel you are expecting to actually cast this for flashback a lot of the time.
Yes, I think so. And this is actually one of the big reasons we decided to discuss this deck today. Is Faithless Looting just Brainstorm? More at 8.
Yeah, we'll get to that a little bit later in the show, but this is probably Red's best form of card advantage. I feel confident in that.
Yeah, so Faithless, I mean, we can talk about Faithless Looting more later. It's a complicated card. It's actually card disadvantage the first time you cast it. The second time around, it's definitely card advantage. And it's a role player. It fulfills a lot of roles. It lets you put cards from your hand into the graveyard. There are lots of decks that want to do that. This deck has a reason for wanting to do that you'll get to in a second. It's legacy playable. It's modern playable. It's Pauper playable. It's a great card. Very good at what it does. And the flashback clause is probably the reason it sees so much play across all sorts of formats. Being kind of similar to a blue spell without flashback.
Yeah, without the flashback on this is probably a fringe playable at best sort of effect. But again, we need a way to actually get to the stuff we care about. This also does fuel Gurmag Angler for what it's worth. Normally 2, sometimes in a pinch 3 if you're not intent on flashing it back. Then we've got 4 copies of Lightning Bolt, of course. We're playing all these bad versions of Lightning Bolt. We've got to play the good one, right?
I want to note to you that this is the only instant in the deck. No, wait, I lied. There's another one. My bad.
Yes, there's one other, but this deck is very much a sorcery speed deck, because following that we've got 4 copies of Flame Rift, which is 1 in red. It deals 4 to each player. Then we've got 4 copies of a new M19 card, Sovereign's Bite. This was one that we, I think we both panned in our review of the set.
It's basically Lightning Helix.
So Sovereign's Bite is 1 in a black for a sorcery. Target player loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. And as much as we do adore making terrible comparisons to Pauper cards to cards in other formats. This is missing a lot of the things that make Lightning Helix so great.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying if Metamorphosis is Pauper Birthing Pod, this is Pauper Lightning Helix.
That's fair. It has the number 3 on it twice. It does have that going for it. Then we've got 4 copies of Tyrant's Choice, which is a bit of a reader. This is a sorcery out of the first Conspiracy set. Tyrant's Choice is 1 and a black, and it has Will of the Council. Starting with you, each player votes for death or torture. If death gets more votes, each opponent sacrifices a creature. If torture gets more votes or the vote is tied, each opponent loses 4 life. So this is almost always going to be 1 and a black, each opponent loses 4 life. Because if you want them to sack a creature, you vote first. You say, I want death. And if they want to keep their creatures around, they're going to vote for torture, which if you voted for death, they likely have a creature that you want dead. So I have to imagine that every time this spell is cast, it's just doming them for 4, right?
So, yeah. So, traditionally, cards like this, giving people choices is not great, right? Like, that's sort of the conventional wisdom. The card that this makes me most think of is Browbeat. Do you know that card?
That's the, is that the mill one? Or the draw 3, right?
Draw 3. It's 2 and a red, sorcery. Any player may have Browbeat, deal 5 damage to him or her. If no one does, target player draws 3 cards. And I do think this card actually did see play because both modes are good for a red aggressive deck. And in this one, it's probably fine also because even if the vote is tied, you're still going to at least do 4 damage to them, which is what you want to be doing anyway. I think in the past, the problems we've had with this deck are just that it's kind of slow in 2 colors. And then this spell costs 2 mana. You have to tap out to do it on your turn. So I don't know.
I mean, as you mentioned, there aren't a whole lot of instant speed ways to interact in this deck, so I'm not dreadfully fazed by the fact that I'm going to be tapping out because there's value in representing having something, but most of the time you're not going to. I don't know.
Yeah, I just always think of Browbeat when I see this card.
Well, so I think as opposed to Browbeat where your opponent gets to make the decision, I think that this only actually has 1 mode in a 2-player game, right? Because if I say torture, even if my opponent says death, I'm still dealing the 4 damage. If I say death because I want them to sack a creature, that probably means they're going to also be able to identify that they have a creature that would be bad to get sacrificed. So they can just vote for death. So because you vote first, I think that this always is the second mode of this card. Much like how Custodial Lich in our format just reads return target artifact, enchantment, or creature, right? I always forget how many different subtypes it gets back, but it just returns a target out of your bin to your hand.
That's true. So it's always an advantage.
Yeah, I just think that this always reads as 1 and a black. Each opponent loses 4 life. Continuing on the trend of slightly fringy black cards, we've got Alms of the Vein, which is 2 and a black for a sorcery. Target opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. But even though this costs 1 more than Sovereign's Bite, it does have Madness for a single black mana. Adrian, let's talk about this card.
All right, let's talk about it.
Is this actually good?
It's good with Faithless Looting, ?
I mean, it's good with Faithless Looting, but outside of that...
You and I have discussed it before. I don't think any of the Blackburn spells are particularly good. One of the big weaknesses of this deck is it doesn't get to play Fire Blast, which I think is a big problem. However, I will say that the more I look at these cards, and I think you said it earlier, there's just a lot more 3 damage spells in this deck than in the traditional burn list, which sometimes has to eke out some incremental advantage via Needle Drop or Curse of the Pierced Heart. So maybe it's not really that bad that this deck can do more damage. If you go Faithless Looting at 3 and then you discard 2 of these and hit your opponent for 6, like that seems pretty nuts, right?
Yeah, I mean that does seem like the optimal sort of situation. I do
and there's
also
only 2 of them, I guess. Sorry, go ahead.
I do also think just because you're running such a low creature count, you are going to be taking a lot of hits in the early game from incidental creatures. So I do think that Sovereign's Bite and Alms of the Vein help offset that a little bit. I think my hesitance here is the fact that a lot of times I feel this is going to be paying retail for the 3 mana for a 6-point life swing, which is not stellar. And here's the thing that stuck out to me the most out of this whole deck. Let's talk about Rhystic Lightning. So Rhystic Lightning is 2 and a red for an instant. It deals 4 damage to a creature or player unless that creature's controller or that player pays 2 generic mana. If they do, it deals 2 damage to that creature or player.
So obviously bad, and I also think this just about the deck in general. It seems pretty bad against Delver, which is looking to leave a mana on your turn and can interact with all of your sorcery speed stuff. That being said, this seems good against Boros Monarch, for example, which is looking to tap out each turn. And if you can play this on turn 3 and your opponent's tapped out, it might be one of the strongest plays the deck has.
I think in the Delver matchup, though, it does still kill most of the things in that deck, even if they pay the 2. So I have a feeling that if this gets pointed at creatures, it's going to get countered hard. Or even if it gets pointed at face, I just feel like a lot of the time it's just going to get countered. And I guess...
Look, if I'm an Izzet Delver player, I would much rather take 2 damage and pay 2 mana than waste a counterspell on this.
That's fair, especially given that you don't really know what's in the rest of this deck, because it's kind of an outsider choice.
Well, 3 damage for 2 damage for 3 mana is very weak. 4 damage for 3 mana is actually not even the best this deck can do, right? Like, this deck is playing Tyrant's Choice. So I don't know. It is definitely a very interesting decision. Maybe they thought that they needed some more instant speed interaction in the deck. I honestly don't know, because it seems even like you could just play straight up Shock or split the difference and play Lightning Strike over this card, which will always deal 3 damage.
I mean, you could even play Incinerate, which is always 3 damage and makes it so creatures can't regenerate. Like, it's marginally better.
Yeah. I am really unsure about Rhystic Lightning. If Thomas, if you're listening, please let us know what this card is doing, because it's another reason we really want to take a look at the deck. It's playing some very unconventional cards.
And rounding out the spells is actually a rather conventional card for a burn deck. It's 4 copies of Rift Bolt, so it's 3 and a red for 3 damage to creature or player. It's sorcery speed, but it does have suspend of 1 red with... It's suspend 1, so you pay a red, it goes into exile for a turn, and then gets cast on your next upkeep. And then in terms of lands, we've got 4 Bloodfell Caves, 6 mountains, 4 Rakdos Carnariums, 5 swamps. So right away,
yeah,
where's the Bojuka Bog? Bare minimum.
So I agree with you. You could probably get away with 1 or 2 black utility lands in this deck. Maybe Bojuka Bog over an extra Carnarium. The deck doesn't seem mana hungry enough outside of the Bump in the Night flashback to really warrant 4 copies of Rakdos Carnarium. I am not a fan of this mana base. Again, can't run Fire Blast because you're running only 6 mountains. And yeah, I just don't think you need, Rakdos Carnarium for no value, basically. I mean, even Rakdos Carnarium Bloodfell Caves doesn't seem very good.
Yeah, it seems awkward. Now, let me... So we've got the option of the utility lands. How about I offer you a couple of other things that might make Carnarium a little bit more appealing to you? So, starting things off, Flame Jab exists. Just a way to cycle those lands, ping your opponents.
Searing Blaze.
Okay, Searing Blaze, I see. And then also in Retrace, there's also Raven's Crime, the discard card.
Yeah.
And most interesting for me is Siphon Life, which is 1 black sorcery. Target player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life with Retrace on it.
That actually doesn't seem bad. It seems like it's accomplishing a lot of what the rest of this deck is trying to accomplish. So, I actually don't mind that. Maybe as a 1 or 2 of.
It just feels like it would get you a little bit more advantage in the form of bouncing those lands with a Carnarium, and also giving you some level of flood insurance in the late game, because I mean it does kind of counteract the game plan of the late game flashback of Bump of the Night, but this does fill your bin up for an angler quicker. It does help you stabilize by draining life out of your opponent.
It feels like such a slam dunk in this list, even as a one of.
Exactly. It just feels like the type of effect that you'd want in here, because it kind of meshes with all these other parts that we've discussed. And I'm kind of shocked I didn't see it in here. All right. Any other land considerations to be had here?
Mortuary Mire seems bad. You have 2 Grimlock Anglers. Don't really need it. Not really a fan of Radiant Fountain in this list. A lot of mana symbols. A lot of colored mana symbols. And, no Prophetic Prisms. So, no, I think we're good on lands. I can't really think of any other utility lands you want to be bouncing, but I do very much like the Retrace idea.
It just seems to fit, especially, like, you saw how powerful Sen's Enlistment was in certain builds of Monarch, just as a way to, like,
I love that
have
card.
stuff. Would you be completely opposed to cycling lands here?
Great question. You could conceivably maybe play an additional land or two. 19. This deck has 19 lands. It's pretty low. You could conceivably play another land or two and have them be like maybe one of each, a red one and a black one.
Yeah, I could see that. I don't hate it, just as a way to make sure that good quality spells actually show up.
We Faithless Looting, which is Brainstorm.
Yeah, it sure is. So let's quickly cover the sideboard here. We got 4 copies Blazing Volley. Adrian?
Sorry. Yeah, I don't know what to think of it. The rest of the deck is at sorcery speed. Maybe they value it costing 1 less over it being an instant. However, like I mentioned before, this deck does seem pretty soft to Spellstutter Sprite and company, so I would rather it be Electricity.
It just feels like Electricity works better here. Just, again, like the Spellstutter interaction, and like you can get an Elves opponent right before they kind of go all in on something with Timberwatch. Although I guess you're not really blocking, so they're just going to Timberwatch whatever's biggest and most likely to survive. So I don't know. I've never agreed with Blazing Volley over Electricity, but here it is. We got 4 copies Chainer's Edict, 3 Geth's Verdict, and 4 Soul Reap. And Soul Reap's the only one of these that should be relatively new to a lot of players. Soul Reap is 1 and a black for a sorcery. Destroy a non-green creature. Its controller loses 3 life if you played another black spell this turn.
So I do want to... go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, this is a lot of removal in a deck that I don't think can win as the control deck.
That's what I was just about to say. It's like you read my mind. The Soul Reap deck, the Soul Reap card, maybe it does damage, but yeah, Geth's Verdict, Chainer's Edict, Blazing Volley, like yeah, this deck is coming in broad swaths, which is a topic on an entirely different episode, looking to address creatures. And you're right, shouldn't the burn deck just be able to outrace that?
Yeah, it feels weird because every time I've played against burn, whether or not I was on the more controlling list than burn or a more aggressive list than burn, their plan doesn't change that much. Out of the sideboard, you bring in things like Pyroblast if necessary, and stuff to kind of help deal incidentally with stuff that you have a difficult time interacting with. And again, I don't know if it was a budgetary thing or what the deal was, but I would love to see some amount of Pyroblasts, in the sideboard here. I can't imagine how this deck sort of plays out against a blue deck. I mean...
So, yeah, I'd be very curious to know what this deck matched against. Obviously, it was piloted to a 5-0, which is no small feat, honestly. It's pretty difficult, and even more so when you're playing a deck like this. Would be very curious to get Jeff's take on this deck as well.
Yeah, it strikes me as kind of odd because we've seen this attempted in the past, and I just don't see kind of the velocity here. Like, if you were to build this deck in something like Modern, you could have Bloodghasts and
you'd also the other
guides.
thing, and a big reason to maybe be in black is that you would also have access to stuff like Thoughtseizing and Inquisition. So you'd be able to be fairly disruptive as well. As we can see, the modern decks do not run those cards. Typically, they're typically red, white, Naya even, but very rarely ever black.
Yeah, this and Thoughtseize makes me think like there's no type of duress effect in the sideboard of this deck. And that feels like the type of effect that you might want for certain matchups to be able to, cherry pick a card out of their hands so that you can make sure that your burn spells resolve. Because
I definitely agree. I think that we're a little overloaded on edicts here. So I wouldn't mind seeing some hand disruption. It's terrible against Spellstutter Sprite, which is the card I keep thinking of when I'm looking at this list, which is kind of funny. And then I might replace the Blazing Volleys with the Electrickeries.
Yeah, and I wouldn't mind seeing some amount of Nihil spell bombs just in case, like even if it's just one, just having some sort of one-sided grave hate.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I think in most burn lists, that's not really a consideration because they're extremely fast. But even in this list, Smash Smithereens seems like it would be a good sideboard card.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, basically just cards that maximize your damage potential. And I think maybe that's really our problem with this sideboard, Mike, is that 11 of the cards don't do damage at all to the player.
And the one that does requires you to double spell in a deck that's running 19 lands, which seems like a bit of a stretch to me. And like I'm looking here at an example of a burn deck that actually posted in the same results, right? The same league results for this week. And I'm looking at the sideboard, and we've got a dual shot, which pings up to 2 creatures. We've got an Electrickery, a Raise to help deal with lands, Molten Rain to also help deal with lands, Seal of Fire to get around Tribe combo, Smash to Smithereens to help deal with artifact-based matchups, and 2 Stagger Shocks. So actually, Stagger Shock is a card that I would much rather see than Rhystic Lightning.
Yeah, this burn list is actually pretty spicy. It's also got a Gut Shot in the main and 4 copies of Fire Blast, but is not running some of the cards. It is running G2 Lava Runner, but not some of the cards I traditionally associate with it, like Gitaxian Probe. I actually quite like this burn list.
Yeah, this one is actually pretty nice. But
should we just cover a regular burn list real fast?
I mean, we could run through this one. Like it's 4 G2 Lava Runners, 4 Thermo Alchemists. Again,
pretty usual creature package.
4 Chain Lightning, 4 Lava Spike, 4 Lightning Bolt. Same thing was seen in this deck that we just looked at. But then we've got the 1 Gut Shot that you mentioned. We've got 1 copy of Magma Jet, the 1 in a red, deals 2 damage to target creature player scry 2. Then we get the 4 Searing Blazes, and I want to talk about this. Do you think Searing Blaze is one of the things that actually sets these decks pretty far apart? Because it's not... It's a burn spell that lets you get rid of a creature, but doesn't waste a burn spell on getting rid of a creature.
I think Searing Blaze is great, especially with G2 Lava Runner.
Okay. So the fact that it can remove a blocker early on and also counts towards the 2 for giving Lava Runner haste.
Yeah, and does 3 damage. So the synergy is a lot better. I will say this deck is missing 4 copies of Flame Rift. But we can get to that in a second. Because it's already 4 copies of Fire Blast. Maybe a split of those would be a little bit better. Because I don't think you're guaranteed to win every game you draw a Fire Blast. I think your odds go way, way, way up. But I think once you start drawing redundant copies, it gets a lot worse.
That's completely fair. And continuing on, there's, as you mentioned, 4 Fire Blast, 4 Rift Bolt, which was also in the other deck, and then 4 Curse of the Pierced Heart, which I think points to what you were talking about with this black-red burn deck, is the fact that instead of having these smaller damage effects like G2 Lava Runner, Thermo Alchemist, Curse of the Pierced Heart, it's kind of going all in on just like big, meaty chunks out of the opponent.
I've mentioned this several times. My biggest problem with the black-red deck is really mana consistency. With 18 mountains, you're going to be able to play your spells.
You're going to be able to play your spells. You get access to Fire Blast. You get access to the double red anytime you hit 2 lands for Searing Blaze. We've said it time and time again, like, mana efficiency within this format is really, really important, because if you're just sitting there trying to set up your mana base, your opponent can do stuff, and you're playing a turn behind. So
I will also say I very much like that this deck is not running any Forgotten Caves, which I think is bad in the mono red list.
Well, so it went up to the full 4 needle drops, which I think probably helps counteract that a little bit, just having more sources of draw that actually advance your game plan. I think that's where that was the justification for cutting Forgotten Cave. So I guess this black-red deck feels to me like it's having a miniature identity crisis, where it doesn't know if it wants to be something similar to Rakdos control list that we've covered in the past, or if it wants to be a burn deck.
I think I agree. I think it wants to be a burn deck. I actually, all right, I'm looking at that list again now. The more I look at it, the more I do like Gurmag Angler, because that's a really good way of like punching in. So I actually don't hate it. Gurmag Angler specifically here. If there was a red delve creature, I'm sure the mono red burn deck would run it, honestly. And yeah, the damage output is a little bit higher, but you don't have the instant speed interaction. Curse of the Pierced Heart and Needle Drop is also, they go together really well. So, you're seeing that little interaction. So yeah, I don't know. I think overall I like the mono red one better, but I definitely think that this deck, props for trying something unique. And I think people, and I sort of want to go here next in the conversation, people are just really drawn to burn.
Well, because I think it's the deck that changes the least over time. Burn decks from 2 years ago and burn decks of today, the creature suite is different, and that's about it. That's the only thing that's really changed. And I think that level of consistency, as well as the fact that, as we've mentioned countless times, it's very portable to other formats where there's a lot of card overlap between Burn and Pauper and Burn and Modern and Burn and Legacy. They all run as many lightning bolts as they can.
Burn is also traditionally very cheap. This mono red deck is only like $16 on Moto, and the black red version is 16 as well.
Yeah, I think there is a budget thing. I also think that it does appeal to a certain player mindset. I think that there are people who just like playing burn in every format because it just has this very consistent game plan. It's trying to get as close as possible to playing 40 of the same card. And I think to some people there's a big appeal in trying to figure out how to make that work, how to make your deck just as ruthlessly consistent at dealing 20 damage as quickly as possible. And I can respect that. And I think that this black-red burn deck has been cooking for a while. I think that people have been thinking about this for a long time, and I'm not sure if this is the absolute solution. There's a couple other things, like I'm kind of frankly just given how people feel about the card in general, and I guess a bit of perhaps misplaced nostalgia, I'm kind of surprised that there's no Blightning here. This almost feels like a deck that would run Blightning as a way to put pressure on the opponent, both on the damage front and also getting rid of cards out of the hand. And
Blightning is 3 damage, right?
Blightning's 3 damage. It is 3 mana. And
do you like it more than Rhystic Lightning?
I mean,
I do.
I kind of do, and my reason here is that Rhystic Lightning, by the time it gets online, I've got to imagine, like, I feel comfortable saying a quarter of the time your opponent will have mana to pay for it. And after the first time they see it, I'm willing to bet that those odds go much higher, that if they can't survive, if they can't deal with a Rhystic Lightning, they're going to leave mana up for it when you're about to hit 3 mana. So I kind of like Blightning a little bit more, because I feel like on average it probably works out to just slightly less damage, and also potentially putting your opponent in a miserable situation, because by turn 3, if you're on the draw, your opponent could have played up to 2, maybe 3 cards out of their hand, which probably means the stuff in there is pretty decent. And I don't hate it here for what it's worth. And I can't think of really any other cards that I would want to try out here that we haven't mentioned already. Because obviously you can't go big on like the black burn spells, and the red burn spells are underwhelming without a way to generate a ton of mana. So I don't know. This just kind of, for me at least, feels like there's a handful of tweaks you could make to it, but outside of that, this might be one of the better black red burn lists by basis of I don't think it's quite there. Like if they had some way that they could jam in, I just keep thinking back, like if you were going to build this deck in Modern, the first thing I'd think is, all right, your creature base starts with 4 Goblin Guides and 4 Bloodghasts. Something that gets down quickly, and in Bloodghast case is recursive. So you can just keep applying pressure. And I feel like that's the thing missing out of this list. There's all your early pressure is in the form of spells. There's no recursive damage, and in your trade-off for that is bigger chunks of damage. So I feel like your percentages go way up against non-counterspell decks and dip down against counterspell decks. So it's kind of my feelings on this list as a whole.
I think you hit the nail on the head.
All right, so you mentioned, somewhat sarcastically, I might add, that Faithless Looting was Brainstorm, and
that's only because you sent me that article.
I did. I sent you an article by Ben Friedman asking, is Faithless Looting Brainstorm? And before the show, I asked you if you thought Faithless Looting was on a level with the blue cantrips. And I do want to adjust that question a little bit. So we've got the blue cantrips, which are the cream of the crop, right?
Right.
And then we have like green got Adventurous Impulse and sort of those dig through the tops. So let's say stuff like Call to Nature, which is a green to look through the top 5, pick a creature out, reveal it, and put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom. Let's say that's our bottom of like cantrips you would ever consider playing, and we'll put Preordain and Ponder at the very pinnacle top. Where for you does Faithless Looting fall?
So to answer that question, I got a lot to say.
Okay.
Faithless Looting is obviously, I think it's close to the top. In terms of what it can enable, I think it's very strong. Putting cards into your graveyard, a lot of decks want that. It's not like Ponder and Preordain where they just go, well, I'm playing blue, I'm playing these blue cards. It's definitely got more of a deck building cost to it. So I think that that's a consideration, but I think that the decks that it goes into make very, very, very good use of it. I'm thinking specifically of Legacy Reanimator, for example. It's extremely strong in that deck as it's a huge enabler. So in Pauper, I think it is less good, simply because the things we can enable with those are generally less powerful than just being able to play blue cantrips. Izzet Delver does not play Faithless Looting, for example. Because the first time you cast it, it is actually card disadvantage, right? You are losing a card to lose two other cards. So the second time around, it's much better because you're flashing it back. The selection is decent. There are decks that I think do maybe get some benefit out of it. People are starting to run it a little bit more in Boros Monarch. And to help give you an idea of where I think it is in that spectrum, I don't think it's at the top. I think it's very close to the blue ones. And I think it and perhaps Ancient Stirrings jockey for position constantly just because of their proven track record in other formats. Ancient Stirrings is actually quite comparable now that I think about it, because its effect is only as weak as the deck you put it into. So, it's extremely good in Tron, for example, even in our format where you're trying to find specific lands, you're trying to find artifacts, but it's awful in a mono green deck.
Okay, so you're basically saying as long as I have a deck that can take advantage of the fact that I'm putting cards in the bin, you feel like this is right there underneath the blue cantrips.
Yes, because, and I sort of mentioned earlier, if you're able to go Faithless Looting, Madness, 2 of these black spells, and then you just get to cast them, like, that's good. Then you didn't really lose any cards. You were casting burn spells you were going to cast anyway at a reduced cost. So then that's 6 damage. Then let's say, this is a bad example, but let's say you discard Tyrant's Choice. You can flash it back later. I don't know if this deck will ever flash back Tyrant's Choice. That's just the one I could think of. It's also good because you can bend some additional lands. So if you get flooded in the late game. So I do think it has its uses.
So I think for me, the reason why I wanted to discuss this is an absurd velocity for a non-blue cantrip in my mind. The fact that
you see 4 cards.
Yeah, and a lot of the time, so a deck like this, I'm looking at it right now. This does not strike me as a deck that mulligans dreadfully well, because it kind of wants to set up a very high density of a certain type of effect. And I feel that every mulligan this deck takes hits it harder than some of the other decks. For example, Blue-Red Delver mulligans incredibly well off the back of the myriad of cantrips, because if you go down to 5 cards in that deck, like, it's not unreasonable for you to win a game with your opponents still playing their 7-card hand, just because of the density of filtering that you have in your deck. And I feel like Faithless Looting in this deck, outside of the Madness and the Delve synergies, I think it's very important to recognize that this is a deck that probably does not mulligan super well, and Faithless Looting is the type of card that lets you get rid of stuff that you don't want now and are unlikely to want in the matchup and get to the good stuff quicker. And I think that article I sent you over earlier, the is Faithless Looting Brainstorm, I think that's kind of the crux of it, is that this is a way to allow you to get away with playing cards that are not as widely applicable in the main deck, or to mulligan into more powerful sideboard cards games 2 and 3. And I think especially for a non-blue color, I think Faithless Looting is, in my mind, the best 1-drop cantrip in our format. And I would honestly probably place it right around the same realm as something like Serum Visions, which admittedly does not see play. But I think
only because we have access to the better ones still. Sorry, go on.
We do. But what I'm saying is, if we saw Ponder and Preordain leave the format, people would play Serum Visions, and at that point, I would say that Serum Visions and especially Brainstorm would be very close. Now, obviously, Brainstorm is card neutral. That's one of the best parts of that card, and this is card disadvantage the first time. But you do always have the option for that second chance out of the bin if you need it later in the game, at which point it is just a looting effect. So I think that combination, like as we mentioned earlier, if you got to cast this one time, it would be miserable. This would not be a good card. Like, you're not seeing a bunch of red decks going out and playing Tormenting Voice, which admittedly, just to get ahead of comments, I understand is a different card. Yes, you're trading 2 cards for 2 cards. I know it's not the same order, but
he knows.
Yeah, I think this would put it in a similar place to something like Tormenting Voice, where it sees play occasionally in very specific strategies, but not widespread application. Where I feel Faithless Looting, because in Monarch the graveyard synergies are pretty minimal from what I can call off the top of my head. Like, you can bin a Battle Screech or a Prismatic Strands, but outside of that, and that's what, maybe 4 cards in the main deck, probably 3.
Yeah, I think it's strong there.
Exactly, that's my point, is that even without that extreme level of synergy where you're binning stuff that just kind of wins, a la the Black-Red Reanimator deck, where this pitching Ulamogs and Dragon Fangs can just be game over turn 2. I think I think that this card is a lot better than it looks or seems in this context. And I'm actually surprised that more decks don't run Faithless Looting on the brewier side of things, because I think if you're not in blue and you can add red to a deck and you're thinking about it, I think Faithless Looting presents a very good value proposition for a lot of these kind of more, strung together with dental floss types of early brews. I think that this card is a lot better than it seems. And
yeah,
I mean, I totally get the card disadvantage argument, but
well, you are getting the selection.
I think that selection is the big thing. Just the fact that you can kind of get away with playing some slightly sketchier cards that have really good situational applications, not like full-on sideboard cards. I'm not advocating like running Relic's main deck, but what I'm saying is these cards that, if your opponent is a blue deck and you see that immediately and you use a Faithless Looting and you rip a pair of the Blackburn spells and you've got enough lands to cast all of them, you're going to keep those, because if you're game 2, they're going to have Hydroblasts. Like that's how almost anyone would sideboard that match. And by being able to filter into something that's situationally a little bit better, I think is really, really powerful. And I think as patently ridiculous as is Faithless Looting Brainstorm is to say, I think it's kind of true. I think that this is kind of in that same sphere of, I don't care what happens, I just want to see as many cards as I possibly can.
Right.
So I don't know. I definitely like to see this in more brews. That's kind of my big thing. Is this is one of those cards that over the years I have come to appreciate, especially over the past weekend watching the Pro Tour and seeing players playing Modern. This card is absurd in that format. I don't know if you caught any of the coverage, but like the Hollow One deck plays this and it uses it to cheat out Hollow Ones quickly. The Vengevine deck that's tearing up Modern.
Yeah, it's really good, and I mentioned that it's really good in decks that can take advantage of the fact of what it does, more so than the blue spells, which are just generically good.
Exactly. So it does have a slight deck building cost, and I love the comparison to Ancient Stirrings because I think that's a great example of. And I'd argue that Ancient Stirrings actually has more deck building restrictions than this.
Absolutely. You have to be green for one thing.
Well, you've got to be in green, but on top of that, like you have to be a deck that can produce green mana, but also has a ton of colorless stuff that it wants to hit.
Right.
Whereas Faithless Looting is just gimme cards. Like if they're crap, I'll just chuck them in the bin and we'll move on. Like bare minimum, I'm just churning through the top of my library, and I don't know. I guess at the end of the day, one of the issues is that one of the best red decks in the format is actually a blue-red deck, which would never play this effect.
Yeah, it just doesn't care.
It's probably the reason it doesn't see as much play as one might expect, but I could definitely see this being a big player. Like, if, and I don't want to get too heavy on this, if they ban some of the blue cantrips, I think that this card's stock rises absurdly in terms of playability within the format. I guess, is there anything else you kind of want to touch on with Faithless Looting? Because I've been talking for a minute here.
No, I think I like your takes. I like listening to you, but I think that's really, I think you said it.
All right. Well, we're getting pretty close to the hour. Is there anything else that you want to send our wonderful listeners at home off with, or do you want to take us on out?
I'm pleasantly surprised we got as much discussion out of that as we did, to be honest. I thought we were going to have to try and find another topic, but it turns out focusing on certain cards, especially how they impact certain builds, is very productive. So even though I'm not, I am impressed that this deck 5-0'd because I think that some of the card choices aren't really the best. I am glad that it got us talking about a card like Faithless Looting.
Yeah, especially because as of late, results have been trending to a very blue metagame. I felt it was worth talking about something else as a counterpoint to that, and I felt like this deck was a reasonable medium to get to this discussion.
Exactly. And everybody, thanks for joining us today. This podcast is brought to the support of our patrons, especially Zango Trick. Please consider supporting us like them if you like the show. You can check below this video or the description of this podcast for details on where to find us. If you've listened to this on a platform with reviews, they're always appreciated because they boost our visibility. / if you've got a deck list, an idea for a topic, please feel free to contact us either via our website or by email us directly at colorcommentary@gmail.com. Special thanks to my LGS Pats Games, Mike's LGS JP Comics, and of course L. You can find our theme song Quantitative and other great songs over at soundcloud.net/ELLELLELL. Till next week, this is Adrian and Mike, and we are signing off for Color Commentary.